This is the first recording in the chapter 11, which is all about the respiratory system. And these are my lungs after running to the end of my driveway. So some of the goals for today, we've got a few definitions. This whole lesson is going to focus mostly on anatomy. So we're going to define the respiratory system, ventilation, pharynx, larynx, vocal cords, glottis, epiglottis, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, lungs, and diaphragm. We'll just summarize the major functions of the respiratory system and each part of the respiratory system. We're going to be able to trace the path of the air that the air takes from the nose all the way to the lungs, and then finally describe the layers of cells that a molecule of oxygen has to pass through to get to the red blood cells and into the tissues. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a diagram of the respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system is to get oxygen into the blood and get rid of the carbon dioxide from the blood and have that exit. Another word for breathing is ventilation, and that includes both the inhalation, taking air in, and expiration or exhalation bit where we're exhaling. When we have the inhalation and exhalation, air is conducted towards or away from the lungs by a series of cavities and tubes and openings. So we're going to go through all of those different openings in this lesson. So the respiratory system works very, very closely with the circulatory system. In fact, they are also known as the cardiovascular system, and they have a number of homeostatic roles that they perform. The first one is the exchange of gases. So that's the external respiration. So that's when oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged between the air and the blood. One of the other functions is transporting the gases to and from the lungs and tissues. And then finally, we've also got the internal respiration where that gas is exchanged between the blood and the tissue fluid. Another homeostatic role is maintaining blood pH, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the chapter. The respiratory system has a major function in blood pH because if we get a buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood, it can actually be acidic. So here's a close-up look at the respiratory system again. You can see the nasal cavity and nostrils kind of starting things off. We've got some similar structures when we talk about the pharynx that we looked at in the digestive system. And then air is going down through the epiglottis and glottis into the larynx, and that connects in with the trachea. The trachea brings the air down to the level of the lungs. That air goes through the bronchus and bronchioles and into the lungs. On the right-hand side, you can see a close-up of what the lungs look like if you were to take a microscopic view. Those bronchioles are branching, and at the ends of the branches are alveoli, which are little balls at the end that are surrounded by a capillary network where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide actually take place. So going through those things kind of step by step, the first step in respiration is inspiration. That's where air is coming into the whole system. So air is filtered, it's warmed, it's moistened as it moves along the respiratory tract. The nostrils are playing a big role in filtering the air. Also the cilia and the mucus of the nasal cavities and airways are also making sure that any dust particles and large debris are kept out of your lungs. As they go along these passages, the air is warmed by the heat given off by your blood vessels that are close to the lining of the airways and moistened by the wet surface of the airways as well. In the exhalation phase, the air is cooling and losing moisture as it moves out of the respiratory tract, and that is depositing more moisture in the lining of the trachea and the nose, which is then used within inspiration. This is a picture of close-up of what the cells that line the interior of the nasal passages look like. You can see that they have long cilia all on the outside of the cells, and that is working to trap any debris and also to warm and moisten the air. So the only external portion of the respiratory system is the nose. As the air enters through the nose, it's moistened in the nasal cavities because of the mucous membranes. Those nasal cavities are separated from the mouth by what's called the palate. We've even looked at this before with the hard palate and the soft palate. Soft palate is extending a little bit further backwards, and that is taking that air into the back of the throat or pharynx. The pharynx connects the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx, and it contains lymphatic tissues as well called tonsils. Those contain lymphocytes, so those are those white blood cells that help protect against pathogens. Now, at the back of the throat, we have the epiglottis that closes off, preventing passage of food into the lower respiratory tract. When that epiglottis is opened up, where we are allowing air into there, the air will go into the glottis, and that allows air into the larynx. So this is where the vocal cords are. So if you take a look from above, vocal cords stretch across the glottis. So this is down below the epiglottis, and go across the opening of the trachea. When air is expelled, when it's pushed out through the glottis, the vocal cords vibrate, and that's what actually produces the sound for our speech. Now, the glottis is narrow when we make high-pitched sound, and it widens as the pitch deepens. So people with a higher voice just means that they have a narrower opening with the glottis, and deeper voices or lower notes are when we have it widened. The trachea is also called the windpipe. It connects the larynx with the bronchi. The trachea is a lot of C-shaped cartilaginous rings that allows the passage of air. It keeps that air tube open, cleans, warms, and moistens the air. And inside the trachea, there's mucous membrane that contains a couple of different types of cells. There's the goblet cells that actually produce the mucus that is warming and moistening the air, and there's ciliated cells that sweep that mucus and any debris that it has caught towards the pharynx. So it sweeps it upwards so that it can later be swallowed or expelled. This is what those two types of cells actually look like if you're to look under a scanning electron microscope. So we're looking at a scale that's on the scale of micrometers. It's very, very small. The goblet cells are the big kind of round shapes that you see on this diagram. The cilia, on the other hand, are the ones that kind of look like hairs. One thing to note is that in chronic smokers, the cilia actually start to disappear, and that allows debris to enter the bronchial lungs because it's no longer sweeping it up. So the bronchial tree, so the trachea divides into the bronchi, which then lead to the lungs. Those bronchi are branching into secondary bronchi called bronchioles. So if you think about arteries and arterioles, bronchi and bronchioles, kind of similarity there. Each bronchiole leads to thin-walled air sacs, and these are the alveoli. This is where the gas is actually exchanged between the air and the blood. So alveoli are very, very thin, single cell thick, and that's where we have diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The lungs, of course, we have them paired. They come in twos. At the base of the lungs is muscular diaphragm. So the diaphragm goes all the way across the bottom portion, kind of the ribs there. It's the muscle involved in inspiration and expiration. So it's what's actually filling the lungs with air. When the diaphragm moves down, it creates a negative pressure which opens up the lungs and forces air into them. When it moves up, it creates a pressure gradient where air is expelled from the lungs. So there's nothing actually attached to the lungs per se. It's actually the diaphragm creating a pressure in the lungs that opens and closes those lungs. Now, during inhalation, air is entering the lungs by the bronchial tree and moving to the alveoli. The gas exchange occurs between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. And inside the alveoli is what's called a pulmonary surfactant. It is a film of lipoprotein that just prevents them from closing off so that inhaled air can enter. This is very, very important with premature babies. Premature babies don't usually make the surfactant very well, and sometimes artificial ones are needed. But this is why having newborn babies in the NICU is so important, because usually you're looking for pulmonary distress. Here is a close-up diagram of the alveoli, or one alveolus. You can see the network of capillaries that surround each one. Those are very, very thin-walled, the alveoli itself, and then also the capillaries. So you just have basically crossing from the air inside the alveoli across that membrane or across that single cell layer, and then one cell layer into the capillary network. So this is just showing kind of a summary of what each part of the respiratory structure is taking place. Please have a read through 11.1 for each one of these things. And there's a summary of what's the important concepts in Chapter 11. So please go through the questions on the next page of the Moodle site, and we'll discuss these in class. Thanks.